Okay, just to be clear, this is not a council meeting. This is an information session and really to bring us and anybody that's interested in the public, and we are streaming this live, so you can follow along with us, but it's got to get an update where we're at with our long-range financial plan. Been working on it, and we have some dates in here, and without further ado, I will turn it over to our Director of Finance, Jeff Schmidt, and he can introduce Hempson's representative.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council, members of the public. Again, as the mayor indicated, this is not meant to be a formal council meeting, if you will. We're not looking for any approvals, if you will. It's simply to provide an update on the township's long-range financial plan. We do have Stefan here from Hempson, who has been working with staff for essentially the last year and a bit, if you will, on the long-range financial plan. So today's session is really to talk about where the township currently stands, or if I can state in different terms, is what is the township's current financial health, if you will. So today, the purpose of today's meeting is not to talk about the impacts of development within the township, if you will. That will be, we'll discuss a little bit more about that in the presentation, but the actual results of that exercise will be happening at a later date. So without further ado, I guess with that said, I'll turn things over to Stefan to walk us through the presentation. And I think we talked at the beginning that we'd prefer if we could go through the presentation and have questions at the end of the session. So,
okay.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, members of the public. I have about a 30-minute presentation for you to update you on the long-range financial plan. Just a reminder of the objectives of the plan, because I think it was some time when we last articulated these. So what we are doing with this plan is to try and convey to council and the public some understanding about the current financial position of the township, to forecast how that condition might change over the next 20 years, particularly in the context of the financial impact of the development that's being proposed in the Midhurst secondary plan. And finally, to provide council and staff with the tools to ensure the long-term fiscal sustainability of Springwater. And those will take the form of a set of policies that will be brought before council and a financial model that is to be used by township staff. So really what I'd like to do today is set the stage for the results of the financial modeling that will be presented over the coming weeks with staff over the next couple of weeks, then to Finance Committee in early March, and then to Council subsequently. And talk a little bit today about the demographic and socioeconomic conditions that underpin the plan, particularly the growth prospects in the township. The current financial position of the township, using financial indicators and comparing with similar and surrounding municipalities, and then finally end up with a discussion of next steps and the policies that we intend to bring forward. I did want to just spend a bit of time informing council about the activities that we've had since we were last in front of you, because I know it has been some time since that's occurred. So this is the public consultation that we've completed to date. As Jeff mentioned, we had a sort of formal kickoff in the fall of 2014 with a public stakeholder meeting that outlined the goals and objectives of the plan, how the analysis would be done, and who's involved and who does what. In the spring of 2015, we presented a package with information about growth forecasts. We looked at existing growth patterns in Springwater, and we proposed 3 growth scenarios: a low scenario, a medium scenario, and a high scenario. And I'll reiterate details about those scenarios in a few minutes. The following month, in May 2015, we had another public session where we released information relating to the capital development programs that might be required to meet the needs of growth under those scenarios, as well as a whole range of assumptions about future assessment growth and operating cost impacts. The assumptions that were included in the material that was distributed at that meeting were vetted by Finance Committee and indeed Council approved a number of what we referred to as base parameters that we were to use as consultants for modeling and testing, including parameters about how much debt the township was willing to take on, how much they were going to contribute to reserves over the next 20 years, and how they were going to manage capital assets. We got a lot of feedback from those information packages, and mainly from a lot of it was technical in nature, and we decided in late May to sit down with the Midhurst Landowners Group and its various consultants. That was a public session as well, so members of the public were in attendance. And that was really an opportunity to clarify some of the information that was included in those packages and to clear up any misunderstanding about the information that was in those packages, and also to identify any areas of disagreement that might exist about the assumptions that we were using. We had a second information session with those technical consultants in June, and where a lot of the issues were narrowed. But I think it's fair to say we did not achieve consensus on those assumptions at that particular date. In the subsequent months since that June meeting, right up until the end of 2015, there were numerous meetings, internal and with various stakeholders, and correspondence with the Midhurst Landowners Group and other stakeholders to try and bridge the gap on some of the disagreements about those assumptions. I have to report today that there are disagreements that remain. The two main ones relate to the occupancy patterns that are going to exist in the new residential homes that are anticipated to be built in Springwater, and about the potential assessed value of those homes. I will say, though, that the extra time and the consultation has not been for nothing. Consensus was achieved on many other issues, but certainly I think it's fair to say we reached a point in time in late November or early December where we sort of agreed to disagree, and we got the blessing of the Midhurst Landowners Group to proceed with the analysis on the basis that we were still going to disagree on those particular issues. So that is where we are today. I would like now just to focus a little bit on the major demographic and socioeconomic assumptions that are going to underpin the modeling analysis, and we'll be coming back to these when we look at the results in a few weeks. But just to summarize then the growth prospects that we are testing for the plan, there's been very little change to these low, medium, and high growth scenarios from when they were released in the spring of last year. The only major changes are that we propose to move the 20-year planning horizon from a 2015 base year to a 2016 base year, given the passage of time, and Council is now dealing with a 2016 budget. The low scenario, however, remains the same. The growth under this scenario is going to be based on past growth trends in the township. That is to say, there will be continued development of the plans of subdivision that currently exist, but there will be little or no growth in the Midhurst secondary plan modeled in this scenario. And then we'll have medium and high growth scenarios, which are essentially the low scenario with a certain amount of growth taking place within the Midhurst secondary plan at various growth rates. So under the medium scenario, the growth rate would contemplate build out of 300 hectares of land resulting in about 4,600 new homes within the secondary plan area. That number, the 4,623 units, is based on a phasing plan that was submitted by the Midhurst Landowners Group. And under the high scenario, it is basically the low scenario with a rate of growth within the Midhurst secondary plan that would result over the 20 years of the construction of 7,858 new homes in the secondary plan area. And that figure is anchored on the amount of development that was assumed for the Phase 1 and Phase 2 environmental assessments that the township undertook a few years ago. So, to the extent that population is a key driver of municipal expenditures, the population forecasts under each of these scenarios has been a subject of close scrutiny. The model relies heavily on population drivers for the financial analysis, and you can see here this graph shows you for the last 20 years that the population growth in Springwater has been fairly steady, fairly sustained. Under the low scenario, that fairly steady rate of growth is set to continue up until 2035, 2036, and the medium and high growth scenarios represent a rapid acceleration of population growth from what we've seen in the past. The population growth that we've seen in recent years has been fueled mainly by people migrating into the township in their 30s and 40s. These are family-forming homeowners, so you can see that the net migration by age in Springwater between 2001 and 2011, mainly comprising of people in their 30s and 40s, and then children in their teenage years and younger. The main out-migrants from the township have been people in their 20s. Almost certainly these are people who have left school and are now looking to move elsewhere for education and job opportunities. So that is a pattern that we would expect to continue, certainly among the low scenario, but perhaps some shifts among the high scenario. The only other outflow we see on the migration side is among seniors. This is when people get to the age where they want to be perhaps closer to younger family members or to healthcare facilities, perhaps in urban areas. We see them also leaving at that stage in life. Age is important to understand, and we'll be coming back to this when we look at the results, because age is an important factor when we look at the demand for municipal services. People of different ages demand different levels of service and indeed different types of service. So this chart here shows you, the blue bar shows you the current age structure of the population, and you can see it's dominated by people in their 40s and 50s and children in their preteen and teenage years. And then the light blue bar shows the age structure that is forecast under the low scenario, the low growth scenario. So you can see the features of the 2036 population. It's a much older population. Those people in their 40s and 50s are now in their 70s and almost, are almost certainly retirees, or the vast majority of them will be retirees. We also see in-migration now among younger family-forming people in their late 20s and early 30s, and we see a larger bulge among very young children, the cohort of 0 to 4 years old. So what does this mean from a fiscal perspective? It means that the demand for housing will remain high, even under the low scenario. It means that we might see some shift in the demand for recreation services. and programs, particularly among seniors. We might see, especially with more development, it puts much more pressure on fire and road services, and it might mean under the medium and high scenario a demand for new types of service such as transit. But principally, the aging of the population will mean much more for county services, things like long-term care services that were provided at the county level than at the township level. Where the development is set to take place will, of course, affect where the demand for services is. And so when we look at the low scenario, we see, of course, that the distribution of development will be in the existing settlement areas of the township, and very, very little in the Midhurst secondary plan area. And then,
We're going to take questions after. Okay.
and then under the medium and high scenario, obviously with the majority of development taking place within the Midhurst secondary plan area, 2/3 of it indeed under the medium scenario in the MSP, and fully 3/4 of it under the high scenario. When we look at growth from the non-residential perspective, the model will use employment growth as a proxy for assessing the impact of non-residential development on expenditures and revenues. So the graph here shows you the historical and forecast employment growth in the township. And you can see, again, fairly steady employment growth up until the last census period between 06 and 11, when there was a bit of a slowdown. You would see that pattern in many, many other municipalities in Ontario, and that is a feature of, the regional and indeed global slowdown in the economy and the slow recovery that we continue to experience. And then in the future, then under the low scenario, things picking up somewhat round about this time and continuing on its sort of historical trajectory up to 2036. But then under the medium and high scenarios, employment job growth accelerating well beyond the historic trend. There's been lots of discussion about what kind of jobs we can anticipate and the rate of job growth under each of the scenarios. So this is a summary here on the left of the forecast job growth to 2036 under each of the scenarios. So if we look at the bottom there, you can see obviously a higher number of jobs under the medium and high scenarios and under the low. In the rural areas, we assume that job growth is going to be constant under each scenario and fairly inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. The population-related jobs, that is the jobs that will arise to meet the needs of new homes, will largely mirror the residential growth. So as we get more homes, we will get more of these kinds of jobs, the grocery stores, the Tim Hortons, the stuff that is built within or close by to residential neighborhoods, a lot of it commercial retail type employment. That is in direct relationship to the amount of residential growth. And when we look at the jobs that are going to occur on dedicated lands set aside for business parks and industrial development, the so-called employment land employment, the growth forecasts assume that future councils will put into place policies to allow employment lands in the Midhurst secondary plan to develop and to achieve the secondary plan goals and objectives. That is the development of employment lands within Midhurst at sufficient densities to allow people to live and work in those areas. The ratio of jobs to people does speak to the completeness of a community and indeed the extent to which people commute in and out of a municipality to work. And from a land use planning perspective, there are very, very good reasons to strive for complete communities. There are also good fiscal reasons why municipalities might want jobs and the development of non-residential lands within the municipality, mainly because non-residential development tends to place less demand on municipal services relative to the tax revenue that it generates. So if you look at the top left, the chart there, you can see that right now, as of the last census, the activity rate, the ratio of jobs to people, was 32%. It's roughly one job for every 3 people here in the township. And under the low scenario, by 2036, that's forecast to change relatively little, a drop by 2%. But under the medium and high scenario, given the amount of residential, overwhelming amount of residential growth, the activity rate, the ratio of jobs to people, is set to fall from about 1 in 3 to 1 in 4. I should stress, however, if you look at the bottom chart here, you'll see that under the growth plan and the county official plan, the fall in the activity rate is not atypical of the lower tier municipalities in Simcoe County. So all of the municipalities you see here, their activity rates are set to fall under the growth plan targets that have been set for them, with the exception of the rapidly urbanizing municipalities in the southern part of the county, like Innisfil and Bradford, and Barry, which is set to stay the same. But everywhere else, it is set to fall. Municipalities, and indeed Springwater, is heavily reliant on the property tax as its major source of revenue. And the property tax is a tax on the assessed value of property. So for a non-urban municipality, Springwater has a relatively rich assessment base. And we look at the chart on the left, you can see that the weighted total assessment per capita in 2014 was quite high. That is to say, for every person, you generate more tax revenue in Springwater than you do in all of those municipalities to the left, with the exception of Innisfil, Collingwood, and Wasaga Beach. The reason for this is that you have relatively high value homes here in Springwater. And on the right is the weighted residential assessment per capita for 2014. And indeed, if you look at places like Innisfil, Collingwood, and Wasaga Beach, a lot of the properties that are pushing them up towards the higher end of the scale there relate to properties that are on lakefronts, that are owned by second homeowners, and that's the reason for that. So even in the context of the sort of municipalities like yourselves in the northern part of the county, the Springwater has a relatively rich assessment base. I mentioned earlier the fiscal advantage of non-residential assessment. And Springwater actually has a comparatively low proportion of its overall assessment base as commercial and industrial assessment. So if you look here at the profile of the Springwater assessment base, in the first column of percentages there, you'll see that fully 84% of it is residential, and 10% of it includes things like pipelines, farms, and forests, and only 5% is in fact related to commercial and industrial land uses. If you contrast that with a sort of urban place like Barry, you'll see obviously there's a far more of a concentration of commercial land uses and industrial land uses. So almost 1 in 5, almost 20%, I should say, of the unweighted assessment in Barry is commercial industrial. And even in the context of the other municipalities that we've compared to Springwater, in the northern part of Simcoe and elsewhere in the county, a similar residential component to the overall assessment base but higher than on the commercial industrial side than what you'd see in Springwater. The message here, I guess, and we'll be coming back to this, I'm sure, when we talk about the results, is that one of the keys to the fiscal sustainability of the township will be to ensure that whatever scenario the township proceeds with, that it does foster the development of commercial and industrial lands. Another good indicator of financial sustainability is household income. The after-tax income of households can speak to the ability of homeowners to pay property taxes, and by extension speaks to the revenue security of a municipality. And you can see here that for the latest figures that we have on median household after-tax income, Springwater comes out at the top of our comparative municipalities. So a large amount of disposable and discretionary income among the householders here in the township, within a relatively narrow range. The flip side to this, of course, is that the more disposable and discretionary income that homeowners have, the higher demand for services they might place. So there is a cost side to this, as well as a so-called plus side from a revenue perspective. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes then talking about the current financial position. We have, as I said, moved the base year to 2016, so the model that we are running right now includes all of the 2016 budgetary information that you have seen. So a lot of what you see in the next few slides, I'm sure, will be familiar to you. There are two budgets at the township, a budget that is supported by the property tax and another one that is supported by the utility rates for the water and sewer services that you provide. We're going to focus on the tax-supported budget for the next few slides. And this is just a summary of your 2016 tax-supported budget expenditures by different categories of accounts. And you can see here that total expenditures are just over $16 million, and just over half of that is related to salaries and benefits in the township. That's not at all unusual. We would normally see salaries and benefits, depending on how you slice and dice them, anywhere between 45 and 60% of a municipality's gross expenditures. And that includes, by the way, an allocation of police expenditures from the police contract. The second biggest component of your gross expenditures then related to contractual services, and consultants, comprising about 14% of the total gross budget. 9% relates to transfers to reserves and reserve funds, mainly for capital works. 6% for general operations, 5% for obligations to pay principal and interest on long-term debt, 4% for fuel and vehicle expenses, and then 3% and less for these other various items here towards the top end of the pie. When we look at the revenue side of the ledger, again, total revenues the same, $16.3 million. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the township, like many other municipalities in Ontario, is heavily reliant on the property tax to fund its expenditures. So property tax revenue at around 62% of total revenues. The other substantial component of your revenues is the police service charge that you impose, other user fees and charges, your building permit fees and development application fees, and to the extent fees are charged for fire or recreation or library or corporate services. Grants and contributions, 5% of the total. 5% of the total transfers from reserves and reserve funds. So you'll notice here that you're putting more money into reserves than you are taking out for this particular budget year. And then 4% income earned on investments and interest, and then some other minor items there as well. When we look at the 62% that is funded from the property tax levy, this is how that property tax levy requirement is split up into the various departments that we have here at the township. So the biggest component relates to your public works, including your roads and road maintenance and road construction, 36% of the total. And then fairly evenly distributed between policing, recreation, and general administration, which picks up all of the corporate finance clerks, mayor and council, purchasing, CAO, IT, HR, that sort of thing, and then fire, and then the smaller portions of the pie for planning services, library, and conservation authority and BIA services. The total tax levy requirement of just over $12 million. When we look at your reserves, we see that the total cumulative reserves, the projected opening balance for 2016 is $18.6 million. This particular chart includes the reserves that are in your utility reserves, fully 38% of the cumulative reserves, but of the tax supported reserves, we see that the major portion relates to reserves set aside for capital expenditures, and then we have reserves and reserve funds that hold and manage cash in lieu of parking and parkland that are contributed by developers. We have reserves set aside to stabilize the tax rate. We have operating reserves, which are the general purpose reserves, and then we have discretionary reserves as well, tax-supported discretionary reserves. We're going to look closely through this analysis at what you need to set aside in reserves and reserve funds. So I did want to sort of highlight why reserves and reserve funds are important. When we distinguish costs between capital and operating costs are fairly predictable, they're fairly stable, and when we model them in response to the overall growth in the township. So it's a fairly gradual increase or decrease in costs that we're able to, in a fairly predictable way, model for operating costs. But when we look at capital costs, we see that they can be quite substantial, they're spiky, and when we model them, the graph sort of looks like this. And so what reserves do is they allow you to mitigate the spikiness of those capital investments. So you can fund one-time large short-term requirements. You can set aside money to make sure you have it in the year that you need to spend it if you're building a facility. They also allow you to deal with shock expenditures, unanticipated expenditures, like a really bad winter where you have to spend more on snow clearing. They allow you to avoid having to take on debt to pay for capital expenditures, so thereby reduce your financing costs. And very importantly, and becoming increasingly important in the municipal environment in Ontario, is that having reserves also allows you to set aside money for the eventual rehabilitation, repair, maintenance, and ultimately replacement of the assets that you currently own and operate. You've probably heard about the so-called municipal infrastructure deficit. That is because we have a deficit like that because many municipalities have not set aside money, adequate money, in order to take care and maintain these assets in a state of good repair. So what we can say is that in the context of the comparative municipalities here in Simcoe, Springwater has comparatively healthy reserves. We've got three measures here for you. The most important one is the one on the right, in my view. But when we look at total reserves per capita and total reserves per household, Springwater is certainly above the average. And when we look at the amount of reserves relative to how much money you spend in 2014, we see that Springwater is second on the list. So it's 0.86 reserves to gross expenditures ratio, only lower than Wasaga Beach and higher than all our comparative municipalities. This is of 2014, so it's not even picking up your contributions from 2015 or 2016 either. When we look at your outstanding debt, we see that you still have debt obligations related to the admin center dating back to 2010 for roadworks on debt that was taken out in 2013 and 2014, and for upgrades to water infrastructure that was taken out in 2014. Total debt obligations then in 2016 amount to $671,000. This is comparatively low debt burden when we look at your comparative municipalities. So on debt per capita and debt per household measures, you can see certainly near the top. But on the measures that are even more important, debt relative to the amount of gross expenditure that you have, you're at top of the table. And by the provincial debt measure, which measures debt as a percentage of your own source revenue, you are again at the top of the table. The province has a debt limit for municipalities under the Municipal Act, and that is 25% of own source revenue. So you can see here that within Simcoe, no one comes close to that 25%. We're using the right-hand column of percentages here. No one comes close to that percentage. So within a relatively debt-averse environment, I would say, certainly Springwater comes out at the top of the table, as you see. Lots of room to take on debt were council to choose to do so. So I guess the bottom line, the message I wanted to deliver here in advance of the results that you will see over the coming weeks is the financial condition of the township is very good. The financial structure that's in place here is very similar to what we would see in well-run municipalities in other places. And it is a leader amongst its peers on key financial indicators. In that context, there are opportunities to be had under all of the growth scenarios that we are testing. Certainly rapid growth under all of those scenarios, more rapid obviously under the medium and high, can bring with it benefits, not the least of which is increased assessment and the ability to raise more property taxes. Rapid growth and change in the population dynamics of a place can increase the scope and the level of services that are provided. And with increased ability to raise revenue, it also gives you flexibility to address any funding gaps that you may have currently. But there are challenges that growth brings as well. And that's why I've put rapid growth as both a challenge as well as an opportunity. Rapid growth can, of course, bring an increased demand for services. We saw earlier, I highlighted that changes in the age structure can change the types of services that people want, the levels of service that people want. There is certainly a challenge that will be faced in achieving the so-called complete community that the growth plan and your official plan is seeking to achieve. And certainly right now, the medium and high growth forecasts are largely dependent on the development of those employment lands in the Midhurst secondary plan. So it's important for council to be aware of that. No matter what scenario we test, there will still be relatively few options for funding expenditures. You will still be reliant on the property tax, and the challenges of that will be present no matter what scenario we test. And finally, to the extent that there is an infrastructure deficit here, and we need to ensure that assets are maintained in a state of good repair, how we go about doing that, and what level of contributions are required in order to make sure that happens, will, if our work in other municipalities is any guide, this will be a challenge as well. So as well as the modelling results, these are the kinds of policies we're going to be bringing forward to council to address these challenges and try and maximise the opportunities that I've just articulated. So we're going to be looking at policies for setting targets for reserves and reserve funds, and what levels of contributions are going to be needed to hit those targets. We're going to be looking at debt targets as well, and perhaps parameters for managing debt, when to take on debt, and under what terms and conditions the township should be taking it on. We're going to be looking at how to manage annual surpluses and deficits that might arise. Certainly we'll be looking at fiscal policies that address growth management issues, and some of the other issues that have come up in recent weeks in discussions with Jeff and other staff is we want to look at policies that address other non-tax revenues, particularly user fees and charges. To what extent can those be used to fund future expenditures, and investments as well? To what extent can the township maximize its return on investments? And in terms of next steps, as I mentioned, we've got a target of March the 2nd for bringing preliminary results to F&A committee, and we want to do the same at some point later in March, subject to getting approval from that committee to go to the public with those preliminary results, and then on April 6th to come to council with those preliminary results and some draft policy recommendations. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Stephen. So, yes, let's go to council and deal with any questions we have, and we'll start with Councilor Hannah.
Thank you, Mayor French. Stephen, I know I've asked you this question before, but I'm still not clear in my mind. So please, if you could just help me out here. We have $18.6 million in reserves, but we have debt. We're paying $671,000 in interest on the debt that we have. Why wouldn't we take some money out of our reserves, pay off all our debt? I know why we keep the reserves, in case you said we have a shock issue and so on. If that was to happen, we could still borrow money, but we would be saving close to $700,000 a year if we paid off all our debt.
I'm not sure you have asked me that question before, through you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I think that I don't think that in principle there is anything wrong with using debt to finance infrastructure rather than reserves, particularly if it's for infrastructure that is going to benefit people over a long period of time. What that means then is that if you have a large facility that is going to have a 20-year benefit, and you have the payments for that debt distributed over that 20 years, it means that the people who are paying it are more or less aligned with the people who are benefiting it from it. So there's a certain equity involved in having things paid for in that way. But as to the specifics of why you wouldn't just use reserves for this particular moment for these pieces of infrastructure, I'm not sure I know the infrastructure well enough to be able to comment on the specific instances. But that's the principle involved.
Thank you. So I guess I like your answer, because basically what I get from that is that people that are living here now shouldn't have to pay for everything that people may move here in the next 5 and 10 years. The folks moving here in the future will be paying off the debt as well as the current residents. If that's what you said, the way I interpret it, I like that. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Allen.
I think ancillary to that, of the reserves, of the 18.6, we have a portion of that which is invested. Is that correct? Finance Director Schmidt, and we would be earning investment income on a portion of those monies that are in reserves?
Through you, Deputy Mayor Allen, to members of council, the township has limited investments, if you will, and that is one of the reasons that the slide back, 2 slides back, I think, we want to talk about developing an investment policy with the Finance and Audit Committee and members of council, understanding there are some limitations with current staff and expertise as it relates to investments. But obviously, we do have funds that do sit in a savings or in an account that does attract interest. As we know, the prime interest rate has been reduced at least twice in the last year. And my understanding is there's discussions for a potential another reduction. Our current financial institution provides prime less 1.69%. So investment or the interest rate is not great. If we chose to enter into some guaranteed investment certificates, GICs, interest rates again are not, they're slightly better than what we may be getting in our current account, but not substantially, not a substantial difference, if you will. So again, it's something we do want to talk with FNA about. We want to establish a policy in place this evening, and not to jump to the agenda tonight, but there is something on the agenda for tonight for consideration by council as it relates to offering more flexibility as it relates to the types of investments that municipalities are able to enter into, because right now there are some limitations as to what we can actually invest in.
So just further to Councillor Hannah's question then, so we will be looking at that to maximize our returns on surplus monies, which would then offset that 671,000 to a significant extent.
CEO Brinley.
Mr. Mayor, one thing I didn't hear mentioned is, in terms of the debt we have right now, some of it's long-term debt that was actually committed by previous councils. Those things are not open loans. Those are things that were tied in for a period of time. So we can't pay it off. Otherwise, some are development charges, so there's discretionary versus non-discretionary debt. But at the same time, out of the work that we see coming out of the long-range financial plan will be policy regimes, not just about investments, but about debt and how we take on debt in the future and if we take on debt. So it will loop back to what Councillor Hannah is saying, is looking at whether we should take on new debt and what our reserves are for. So I do see that coming out of this mix in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's a very kind of valid point, because if we kind of break out those reserves we have, some of them are obligatory and there's not a lot of discretion in it. Yes, we might be able to borrow against them, but then we're still borrowing. So, you know, it's not all money available to kind of keep us out of debt. Did I see a hand up to my left? Okay, Councillor McConkey.
Okay, Center Bessborough, the growth in there, is that considered in the low or the medium scenario?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's considered under all 3 scenarios.
Okay, because we do have the charts and it's actually rapidly growing, so I don't know if your low would actually, if it's considering it, would be looking at it in a valid way. I guess the other thing I'd like to know is, can we have a breakdown of the percent of growth by ward? Because when we look at the services and the things that are required, we really have to look at where the growth's happening so we can anticipate the services that are required in that area.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, so we have broken it down by settlement area, but not by ward.
Yeah, like when we go settlement area, the only settlement area I saw was Midhurst. That was highlighted out. Yet I've got Snow Valley, and I've got,
Yep.
that it keeps going, and I've got Center Vesper that's going.
Yep.
And I think we really need to, where I'm going with this is the services that are required is like, if we look at the growth, and the highest growth is in the south end of the ward, we look at services, policing. Like, I don't know how we've accounted in this financial planning, but we have to look at the level of servicing. So if we go with the high growth or the medium growth, and the growth is in the south end, the services for that have to be lifted up. And we have to know how much is that going to cost us more, because I think the type of service is probably going to change too. So I don't know if that's going to be considered in your output from the long-range financial, like what with the operational costs, like the levels of services that have to go up.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, certainly the model has the ability to adjust the location of development. So we certainly are forecasting development in Snow Valley separately from what's in Center Vesper, separately from what's in Elmvale and the other settlement areas. So that's all built into the model. And certainly when we developed the capital forecasts under each of the scenarios, we did look at the location of development as a driver in terms of what we might need. And that's certainly the case when we look at the southern part of the township. That's certainly the case when we look particularly at things like fire and recreation services and the roads especially as well. But we have not looked at levels of service at the lower level. So we still think of the level of service as being provided at the township-wide level.
So because we don't really have, like the level of service of policing, we're getting in trouble with now, like we're getting complaints. So with the way the growth is going, we know that we have to increase our level of service, and I don't know if it's, something to take away that, the mayor and our CAO or, talk with the policing that, but I think that somehow we have to build that into our scenarios, that the level of service.
No, and I think Councilman Conaghy has a good point, because if we look at the big picture and we look at Midhurst, when we talk about servicing the growth in the south end, we kind of look at recplexes and all that. But when we look at and I know you'll have copies of our rec master plan that's coming to council shortly, but it probably doesn't address it as deep enough either, because if you looked at, well, let's use Center Vesper as an example. Its build out will be over 2,000 people. It'll be the size of Allentown. But there's absolutely no plan of having kind of local recreation services comparable to Elmville. And there probably should be here, because if you go beyond the catchment area, and I'm not sure you could do it by ward, but if you took the ward, effectively Center Vesper is probably going to become the new service center of Ward 4. But there's no plans, except for maybe a pavilion here or there or whatever, and I'm just hoping that like the input into the model, we get it right, because we do have a bit of conflict. I think our current plan that we're going to see in the master recreation plan gets it a little better than it did the 2009, because it acknowledges that we're probably going to have two major service centers, Midhurst, Elmville, but then we're going to have to support the local settlement areas too. But I'm not sure we really dug it down to, except for saying maybe pavilions and that. And I'm not sure how we address that when we start bringing those numbers in, because I can guarantee you, yes, in 5 years, you're going to see a couple thousand people in Center Vesper, and there's nothing there, So do they drive to Barrie, or did they drive to Midhurst? And they most likely drive to Barrie, and that creates other problems with it. So I think it's a very valid point, and I think it just needs to be a note that we make, and I think it was Councillor Austin, or it's Councillor Austin first? Okay.
Could I start with 3 questions?
Sure.
They're brief. What is a PPU?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, apologies, I should have put that in there. It's a person per unit. It's the number of people living in a home.
Right?
And what is that number that you used to average, just as a probably a follow-up to that? Like per unit, what's the average, 2.9 or what is it? It's a number like that, something.
So it, depending on what you're measuring, in spring water it's round about 3, the average.
Okay. Second question.
Microphone.
Would you turn your mic on, please?
Thank you. My second question is, in your growth scenarios, you predicted for 2036 a much higher proportion of seniors population. Can you explain why? Is it because the current people who are in their, say 30s or 40s are going to be staying in Elkville or staying in Springwater?
So, through you, Mr. Mayor, that age structure comparison is simply for the low scenario. So that's the scenario that doesn't include any of the proposed mid or secondary plan development. And what we're saying under the low scenario is that to the extent that the age of your current population is dominated by the people in their 40s and 50s, in 20 years' time, those people are still going to be resident here, and they're going to be in their late 60s and 70s. So that's just a feature of within all the ins and outs you're going to get over the next 20 years, you will still have a population that is aging under the low scenario. Now that's going to be somewhat different under the medium and high scenario, because you're going to get a much more influx of younger family forming people. So it won't be as pronounced under those scenarios.
And the third question is, how do you go about predicting employment growth? Because I think you did mention that there are, times are difficult economically in the province of Ontario. So that question, and also why is there no growth in terms of rural employment?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So the employment forecast is, as I say, sort of split into 3 components. There's the component that is going to arise from the fact that you get residential development, and that along with people moving and living here, you get a local demand for retail services, commercial services, and institutional things like schools and
But in my mind, it's kind of a which comes first, the chicken or the egg, because I can't see us building homes for people unless those people know that they're going to have some sort of job. So when you say that the population will create its own jobs, I understand that, but you can't have residents living in these homes and then looking for Tim Hortons unless they already have a job to pay for their Tim Hortons. That's what I'm saying.
yes, through you, Ms. Mayor. So it is a bit of a chicken and egg, but it is fairly predictable in that respect. So it's very, if people move to a community and set up a community, then Tim Hortons will come to serve them coffee because they will want to drink it. And similarly, when we approve development plans, we specifically require developers to set aside space for things like schools and parks and all the rest of it to ensure that those key institutions are there to service the community as well. So some of those are baked into the plans that are approved as well.
I'll come back to you, Councillor Austin. Maybe just check your mic off for a second. Councillor Ritchie?
Thank you, Mayor French. You mentioned earlier there, or Councillor Han mentioned there about our level of debt, what we pay a year is $673 or $71,000 a year. And where I'm coming from is I think we've done a pretty good job over the last few years as far as our capital plan. But when I look at the infrastructure deficit, that we have before a lot of this growth is going to come. And once it comes, we're going to have to deal with the plus the existing infrastructure deficit that we have now. So I'm thinking is if we increased our payments to say $1 million a year, but we increased our spending as well too, that would capture, and the reason for that would capture more of our capital, address more of the infrastructure, the existing infrastructure that we have now. And last but not least, we've got good cheap interest rates as well too. We're not getting anything for it in our investments, but at least if we're borrowing money, we're putting it into our infrastructure. So we're going from 671, say, up to $1 million a year. What would that do, just for an example? How much more, is that a wrong approach to take, or is it, you know, like too much fresh air outside? Like, I'm just saying, but it would capture and address the existing infrastructure that we have now.
Yeah.
Because by 2018, 2019, and this is 2016, but I can see by 2018, 2019, there's going to be shovels going into the ground. We see Yorkwood, we see Center Bishop that Councillor McCauley talked about. So we got the existing, and we've got an onslaught coming here.
Yeah.
How do we address that? And my suggestion is that we raise our spending and raise our payments and address that.
So, through you, Mr. Mayor, I mean, certainly one of the directions we got from Finance Committee and Council last year was when we did our base case model, financial model, were we going to increase the contributions for things like asset management over and above what we'd seen in recent years. And the direction we got was, yes, we should increase them to address part, at least in part, the infrastructure deficit that had been identified in your asset management plan that was completed 2 years ago. So that is built into the modeling, both for your existing assets and for the assets that are going to come on stream over the next 20 years.
We just got our master rec plan there done, and when you read through that and all the 80-some recommendations, like, you know, whether it be Phelps or Hillsdale or Gremlin or whatever, we have an infrastructure deficit just in our parks and rec without the capital on the roads part.
Yeah.
So how do we address that before this onslaught of new growth comes? And that's the point I'm trying to make, because I think if we look real hard, we could find an extra $200,000 or $300,000 to increase the spending. We've increased our spending, but we've also increased our payments to pay back as well too.
And I think those are all valid points, and one of the jobs that we have as a council when we come out of this review, and I think Director Schmidt mentioned it, it's up to us to decide, and with advice and feedback from the Finance and Audit Committee, what are the policies we do want to undertake? Do we want to, as you say, you know, maybe we say we're comfortable spending, servicing our debt $1 million a year or $1.5 million a year, and where does that take it? The same as I know one of the things we're going to get back from them is what percentage of our own revenues are we comfortable with that we can put to debt servicing? Because the reality is, when we do spend another $300,000, well, we're probably going to take it from something else, and so we just have to make sure we have the balance. But and that's what we have to decide. And we also have to make sure we don't get caught up, you know, with the fact that, well, okay, let's fix everything and borrow all the money because the interest rates are low. Because we may wake up some morning and be caught behind the 8 ball, but probably not for a while.
There will always be something to fix.
Yeah.
It's like living on a farm. There's always something to do. So, but we've got our master rec plan, but we did our asset management plan. But when you look at that,
Yeah.
and when I look at Midhurst and Center Vesper and all these other developments that's going to take off, all of a sudden, you know, we were to take ourselves just fast forward 4 years from now, and we're running behind the 8 ball. Well, that's why we're doing what we're doing now, to try to look down the road and say, how can we address this? And that's what brings us up.
Councillor Culligan?
Thank you.
No, mine was actually just.
Sorry, I think Director Smith wanted to pipe in here for Councillor Culligan.
Sorry, Councillor Culligan. Just to address some of the questions or some of the comments. One of the things that obviously Council did do in the 2016 budget was actually to put money aside strictly for infrastructure replacement, if you will. So we have put 1% away. Might not seem like a lot, but again, it's every little bit it counts. So that is a step in the right direction. And through policy, some changes in our policies, if you will, that will be coming to FNA and Council, we'll be looking at how do we increase that on a go-forward basis. So you are obviously making some of those corrections already, if you will, or some of those improvements. Also, as it relates to infrastructure replacement, we are looking at asset management, and we are looking at peeling the onion, if you will, the analogy, and looking at our current asset management plan and taking a closer look at that and trying to determine, how much should we actually be putting aside on an annual basis for not just the future replacement of the asset, but also looking at how much money on an annual basis should we be putting aside to actually maintain that asset to ensure it actually lasts 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Because if we're not putting money aside today to maintain it, the likelihood of it lasting 30, 40, 50 years is slim to none. So we're going to have to replace it sooner.
I got to go to Councillor Coghlan. I'll come back to you. Councillor Coghlan?
Sorry, my comment was just to go back. Councillor Austin had asked about the employment for the rural. I don't believe we received the answer for that one.
My apologies, and I'm not sure that I addressed the employment land stuff either. So the rural employment is really employment that takes place outside designated areas for employment. It's there might be sort of auto body shops or flower shops or scattered employment uses throughout the rural area. And there really is no plan. In fact, I don't see a plan to expand that base or to set aside lands to expand that base in any of the planning documents. So we might see sort of incremental additions to that sort of rural employment base, but not in any major way. And certainly it won't be I think I used the words in the grand scheme of things, it's a fairly minor component of what we see, and we don't see that being affected by the amount of growth that's going to occur in Midhurst.
Actually, a comment on that before I go to Deputy Mayor Allen. We may want to do a little more research in that, because the MAFRA, obviously they're reviewing all the on-farm activity policies.
Yeah.
And there's a huge promotion now to processing on the farm, local food hubs and that. I mean, personally, and I sit on the Simcoe County Federation of Agriculture, I think you may see a lot more growth in rural jobs than people anticipate because of processing, not just because of working the fields and that. And we're seeing the provincial policies changing to encourage that. Yeah, they're drawing square boxes around, you can only do this in so many acres, but I'm not sure if you have any access to any kind of research in that, because I do think, in picking up on Councillor Austin, I think, I'm not sure it's going to be flat. I think you may see some growth, and so it may be something you want to kind of bring into the model or whatever as you work on it. Thank you. Deputy Mayor Allen.
Thank you, Mayor French, through you. Just drilling down further on this slide 10, employment growth. To what extent did you, I see your source was based on Statistics Canada data. To what extent did you consider the growth that might happen in Springwater, especially with respect to the Midhurst secondary plan, as being bedroom community type growth, where people come and they travel away from here to work, as many do now, as we've seen from the studies, versus a traditional growth that might have come from Stats Canada to establish a growth ratio of jobs to people. I would imagine the Stats Canada would be pretty standard. You build it, they will come, and jobs will come as well. But our concern is that if we don't have the businesses here, the initiative and incentive for people to come here will be to sleep overnight and go elsewhere for jobs.
So through you, Mr. Mayor. So the Stats Canada data only relates to the historical data that's shown on that graph, not the future. When we look at certainly the population related, the commercial, retail, institutional kind of stuff, we are not assuming that the current jobs to people ratio is going to stay the same over the future period as what we've seen in the past. Particularly when it comes to the Midhurst secondary planning area development. That's why you see the activity rate going down under the medium and high scenarios relative to the low scenario. because we do see that a fair number of people who will be living in Midhurst are still going to use Barrie as a place where, particularly for higher order retailing, Barrie will remain the place where they do go and do that sort of, where they go to the doctor, or where they buy their furniture, or where they make those higher order purchases. The local demand might be satisfied locally, but certainly when it comes to the more regional type functions and activities, Barrie will still play an enormous role in meeting the needs of that population in the southern part of the township. And that is part of the assumptions that have gone into the forecasts. And in fact, there's been a substantial amount of discussion about those particular assumptions with the Midhurst landowners group.
I guess I see on slide 13, we're clearly below the commercial percentage and the industrial percentage. We're below other comparator municipalities, as you pointed out. We're 4 and 1% compared to 8 and 2%.
Yeah.
So that suggests that it has been and continues to be and will continue to be difficult to get commercial and/or industrial development here, which has an impact on the jobs ratio.
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, it will continue to be difficult, and I think the message I've tried to convey here today is that certainly, if some of the policies that we come up with this plan can help to address that issue, then I think that would be a big part of the outcome of where this plan needs to go. It's a very important issue fiscally and for a whole host of other reasons. And I think that, as I said, we've assumed that councils will address it in some measure, but it certainly will be an important one moving forward.
And just one final add-on. Were there any surprises in accumulating this data that struck you as being not what you had originally expected to find? Through you, Mr. Mayor, I mean, to the extent we had a lot of discussion about the future assessed value of homes, and we did a lot of research on that. I guess I was surprised by how high the assessed value of existing homes in Springwater was relative to other municipalities in the northern part of Simcoe. But I've driven around the municipality a lot more than I did a year and a half ago, and I've seen why that might be the case in many of your communities. Thank you.
One of the things in the research I do, and picking up on the jobs, I think we'd be quite happy if we got to 1 in 4 jobs. I just can't see that happen. And I think the big indicator, as Deputy Mayor Allen touched on, is our current assessment relative to other municipalities. I mean, we're so low in commercial and industrial assessment. And I would think if we did a research, we probably average 1 in 8 jobs here. Growing to 1 in 4 would be tremendous. But when you break down the research in that, obviously there's retail jobs, there's service jobs, there's professional jobs and all that. And quite honestly, with the sprawl that we're talking about in most of the developments, aren't they only going to attract kind of the low-end retail kind of jobs, which I don't know what percentage of that is of all jobs. And I'm just concerned as we go down the road and we look at the scenarios and and our assessment growing on the industrial and commercial, I just don't see where it is. And I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that in our particular case, we are talking about bedrooms more than building communities, and I just don't know how you factor that into the research you're doing. Councillor Coggan.
I just wanted to add a note to that. So the work from home, I know that myself, a lot of people in our generation, we travel to Toronto once a week, but we have 4 days a week that we work from home. So how is that also articulated in there? We are bedroom communities, but a lot of the times, no, we don't work here, but we're here 4 days a week, even though our BDO office is in Mississauga.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So work at home employment is picked up in the Stats Canada data. In fact, it's indicated as work at home employment, so it is included in the employment forecasts.
And sorry, did that increase with young professionals moving to this area?
I need to check that, but I think the basic assumption would be that it stays fairly constant.
Actually, picking up on that question, again, back to, we talk about jobs, when we kind of start breaking out the research, it would be nice if we could break it down, okay, these are retail jobs, these are professional jobs, these are doctors, lawyers, et cetera. But also that, what percentage of those jobs are out of the home? Because there's definitely lots of professionals that work out of their home, whether it be insurance agents or, they run remote businesses and they are jobs. But it'd be interesting to know what percentage of all jobs is that, and I'm going to go to the CEO because he has some information he's going to share.
Yes, Your Worship, I just want to add, I do agree with some of the discussion around the challenge in building, especially the higher order industrial or commercial jobs. But keep in mind right now is there's a significant lack of industrial and commercial lands right now and no service lands. And some of our competitors that are there have service lands, and that's one of our biggest challenges. And to be frank, that's one of the opportunities we have with the servicing of bidders, because it will open up some higher order lands. Now keep in mind in terms of our role, Barrie was considered a bedroom community, and some still might consider it, but if you look at their in and out migration of employment, there are more people that come into Barrie to work than drive down the highway to go to the south. And that's proven, that's not just my opinion. Similarly, we will develop a similar role because land values in Barrie have skyrocketed. And so people will be looking for lower priced lands here at our service. So we will develop a role. How it happens will still be determined as the future becomes history. But I'm just saying it will get better. The question is how much.
Very valid point. Councilor McConaughey.
I guess I'm on the jobs thing too. I sort of align with what the CAO is saying, but where I was really disconnected is that right now you're saying that we have 1 in 3 with the low scenario, and yet with the high scenario we're 1 in 4. And yet in the high scenario, we've got policies from the government that's wanting so many jobs per person and stuff like that. So I really find it difficult to go from 1 to 3 to 1 to 4. If anything, if I'm going to get growth, I better go to 1 to 4. And we as a council will have to sort of think of ways to give opportunities for employments, and we really have to look in that area. And I guess the other big question I have is, like, I noticed that for property tax was most of our revenue, and only 10% came from agricultural and forest land. And I wondered, out of that 10%, what would be agriculture versus forestry and that in the other. And to lead to that as well, I guess, I look in the future and I know that through our budget we saw a lot of debt coming on in our next 6-year capital plan. And the only way I see of getting out of debt is you have to have revenue. And one philosophy is that the only revenue you can get is by building. So if we build more homes, do we get more revenue? Because it doesn't seem that the 10% is going to help us, the agriculture and that, they're not going to bring us up to that. So how are we, and this is what I was looking from that long-term financial plan is that when is that point that the housing comes and then we're out of debt, but then we're going to be in a high debt time frame, but when can we sort of be at an ease and be at a normal situation again, like sort of where we are today? Are we going to be there in 12 years? Like when I look at your long-range capital plan, all we're going into is debt. So how many homes do I have to build to get me back more comfortable? And is it homes, or is there other alternatives that we could do to help us keep that debt lower?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, these are some of the results you'll see when next we're in front of you, because you'll see, the pattern of expenditures as they change going forward and the pattern of revenues as they change going forward. And there may be some years where one exceeds the other, and you get a surplus, and there'll be others where you see financial pressure points where we're short of money in a certain year. So, and the point of this plan will be how do we address those pressure points and what do we do in the years of plenty.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And Director Smith?
Sorry, there was one comment I wanted to make about the industrial piece. So you'll likely, as county councillors as well, likely see some recommendations coming forward in late 2016 for 2017 as it relates to tax ratios specific to industrial properties. So there was some preliminary discussions over the last couple of months with my colleagues in the county, as well as in the county as well as at the county, with regards to trying to incent industrial development within the county of Simcoe generally. And one of the thoughts is that the tax rate that the industrial properties are being assessed at right now is substantial, if you will. So the idea is to possibly reduce that, but understanding that by reducing that, there is an impact to other types of properties, right? So we didn't want to make a quick decision, if you will. So the county has been given the direction to go back and do some more research and try to determine what the potential impacts would be. So you may start to see a phasing of that tax ratio for industrial properties over the next number of years, or at least a proposal coming forward. Whether we're all in agreement, we still haven't seen the details. So.
Good, thank you. Councillor Austin?
Okay, so this is a bit following up on what Councillor Ritchie talked about earlier. There were 4 or 5 points that I thought really jumped out on me, at me from your presentation. Number 1, Springwater has healthy reserves. Number 2, Springwater has comparatively low debt. Number 3, tax rates interest rates are really low right now. Number 4, after-tax household income in Springwater is comparatively high. That's what number I'm up to, 5. And these homeowners with the after-tax household income that is high will want more in the way of services. So in light of all those facts that really jumped out at me, or points that did, I think we should be, have a less worry about keeping our tax rates low, because I know we were extremely proud about our low tax rate increase when we did the budget. Whereas I think, and maybe Councillor Ritchie is agreeing with me, now's the time to invest in our future, especially when we take into consideration all the recommendations that are coming from the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. So basically I'm saying we should start thinking about spending more, investing in the future, quality of life in our township.
And that's...
I didn't say anything with raising taxes.
And that's what... and that's what we have to decide. That's why we do need to identify whatever the policies are for the long term. Yes, we have above average, certainly, incomes. But there's still a lot of people, and you look at the other end of the spectrum, we have a lot lower than the low and others. So you got to be cautious of that, where $100 at the bottom end is a lot more than $10,000 at the top end. But no, I think those are all valid points, and we do have to weigh that. What do we need? Because obviously we don't build it just because we want to. We build it because we do need it, and we do have some infrastructure requirements. And good discussion. Councillor Anna.
Thank you. So I'll be quick. Can we go to slide 8, please? If you could bring that up. And I just want to make sure that I'm reading this correctly, but the light blue line, my understanding is that is the high growth scenario.
No, that's the same growth scenario.
That's
So
the low.
low growth. But that's what it's going to look like by 2036.
Okay, so my question being is, we're losing the age groups that would normally use, in my mind, our soccer fields, our splash pads, that type of facility. So if we're losing that type of age group, we shouldn't be targeting building or advancing, if you like, in soccer fields and splash pads and that type of thing, skateboard parks. We should be looking at something that would target the age group that we're going to have in 2036. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I would say that in the context of what is a very long-term view of things, what I see here is in 2011 a fairly sharp, pronounced bulge of people in their 40s and 50s and people in their preteen and teenage years, and in 2036 a much flatter pyramid, which says to me that I wouldn't put it as starkly as not investing in soccer fields anymore, but it would certainly mean that you would get a broader range of demand than you have right now. That is to say, you're going to have people, wanting to use programs and services and recreation facilities that are more geared towards seniors than what you're seeing today. And perhaps, the bottom end of the pyramid, the kinds of programs that are available to families with very, very small children that you might not see today.
Thank you.
But so it's a gradual shift rather than a massive change.
I just want to make sure that I was reading this correctly, so thank you.
It would be nice if actually you could do an animated of that from today and doing the morphing to see what happens, at each of those, because I think, that's the valid point, that if we look out at 2036, we don't need those, assuming it's a low growth scenario. But obviously, it's going to be quite a few years before we'd be there not needing them. And so that would be a kind of an interesting exercise. And we can come up with 1,000 different scenarios. Councillor Coghlan.
Can I also request that, if possible, to have the other growth scenarios included on that, because that shows us one scenario, not all three scenarios, so it'd be interesting to see what the demand would look like with growth.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So that's not going to actually be possible, because we are not. All we're doing with the medium and high scenario is we're layering in a population in Midhurst on top of the low forecast. So we're not doing an age-specific profile of the Midhurst growth.
So for clarification, that's Midhurst? That's all Springwater, correct?
That's all of Springwater under the low growth scenario. So not including any of the proposed development in the Midhurst secondary plan.
So then how does that provide us with an accurate assumption of what it's going to look like township-wide if you're talking about just Midhurst?
No, sorry, that is township-wide.
Yeah, I understand that.
But it doesn't include any of the proposed growth for the MSP under the medium and high scenarios.
Oh, so then how could we use that to tell us what the demands for soccer fields and?
It doesn't. Under the medium and high scenario, that doesn't give you any information about the future demand.
Thank you.
Yeah. But the only thing I would say about the future demand under the medium and high is that the effect of the aging that you see here is mitigated by everyone coming into Midhurst who are going to be much younger. So it will look very differently under the medium and high.
Or just some other lines.
Yeah.
Councillor Ritchie.
I just wanted to mention, we talked earlier there about employment and people working from home. I think one thing to keep in mind that a good majority of Springwater is rural, and bringing internet capability to the rural areas is very, very important to maintain and increase that work from home concept, or to even bring business, period, whether you're working from home or whatever. And I look to my mayor and my deputy mayor to take that to the county level, because on the economic level with the county who's got a lot more money than we have, they can help bring that to not just Springwater but to all of the county. And that, like, there's certain areas, and as a realtor, people will ask, is there internet capability? And there's some areas where there's not. So I just want to mention that while we're talking about it. So
Since you brought it up, there is actually an initiative, just so you know, at the county. And the county Simcoe's actually joined the Western Wardens group to try and obviously come up with a high-speed fiber optic new main line, and looking for investments from all levels of the governments over the next 10 or 20 years so you can get high speed to all the various hubs, so you can provide at the local level. So there is an initiative being undertaken, and as a matter of fact, it's one of the subjects I'll be bringing up when I meet with the Minister of Roma. A very good point. Any other questions from us here? If not, what I will do, I will allow about 10 minutes if anybody from the audience wants to ask a question, but only 10 minutes. It's not going to be a free-for-all, and we'll get you a microphone. And just turn one of those on.
Hi, I just want to know, my name's Barbara Kuchar.
Okay, good.
And I live in Midhurst. Why wasn't Oromadonte used on the list in comparison, since we're about the same size, Oromadonte, we have a similar population, why wasn't it considered in your plan like us and everything else?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm not sure that I can answer. I can give you a good answer to that, other than the fact that when we sat down to make the list, I just think it didn't make the cut. But I don't think it would be too onerous to include it in our comparisons.
And I think that is a very valid point. I'm not sure why we didn't think of it. Like, as a matter of fact, it would be appropriate to kind of include the bordering, and that's Oromadonte, Tiny, Tay, and because we have the rest of it. So yeah, that's a very good point. Any other questions from the general audience? Okay, well, thank you for all that information. That was very, very helpful. And so for the members of the audience, we do have a timetable. This information will be going to the Finance and Audit Committee. Sorry? Oh, someone, okay. Come forward. I didn't see you behind Mr. Schmidt here. Or well, actually, we can get you a microphone. We'll get you the microphone. Yeah. Do you want to take it to
I think it's green, Katie.
Is it green?
Not sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Say it, Wade.
First thing I want to say is how much I appreciate the kindness and good fellowship in Springwater that I find all the time as a disabled person. I appreciate that. Here's my question. I listened carefully earlier. Stefan, you referred to the fact that there were two key factors that you as the consultant representing the township and the developers group, two big issues that you haven't come to any common theme on, and you've agreed, as you say, to disagree. Those items seem pretty big to me. And you mentioned you got the so-called papal blessing to go off and do what you're doing, that the Midhurst landowners group didn't agree with it. That's the impression that I got. And that's what you're doing, and it's going to be a valuable exercise for Springwater. But without them agreeing, what's the fallout from that once the report is presented? Presumably, they have figures on those two contentious issues that are more favorable to the scenario they believe in than perhaps you would. So I'm just trying to understand how such a major falling out on big issues is actually going to impact this report going forward, and what you guys can really do with it. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I think we understand the question. The disagreement, as you mentioned, PPU and assessed values. So we're going to run scenarios, I assume, with the assessed values we feel comfortable with. And if there's disagreement, or for some reason it doesn't kind of look the way, certain parties want it to, what is the recourse? Is this subject to O&B kind of discussion, or is it just agree to disagree?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, I'll answer the easy part of the question, and then I'm going to defer that to higher powers. They are big issues.
Yes.
To the extent that they influence the results.
Right.
In a major way. What that means for the result, and in terms of what we're testing, we are testing our own professional opinion on what those assumptions should be, based on the research that we've had, and indeed the feedback we've received from those technical consultants. Okay. So they are assumptions that have been vetted by staff and others, but they are our best professional opinion of them. As for what that means for appeals and future feedback, that's out of my scope of.
And I'll go to the CAO and make comment, and I have a brief comment.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There's actually no municipal requirement for conducting a long-range financial plan.
Right.
This council has chosen that as we manage our house in the future, that we want to be sustainable, we want to do it the right way. So although we try to come to an understanding by going through these exercises, there's no requirement for the municipality to side on any issues. And I also want to be respectful of the Mayor's Landowners Group, because it isn't about who this benefits, it's about who feels they have the right numbers. The municipality will go forward with the numbers that they feel are the right numbers. And what happens though is there's nothing they can do to stop this process. There's no appeal mechanism, there's no anything. That said, out of this process, there may be an example to have a recommendation that we update our development charges bylaw. Now, if the bylaw has data that comes from this exercise, that is where anybody could appeal this process. Not this process, but that process.
No, and I think it's a very valid point. I mean, one of the comment I wanted to make is, is that this is a exercise we undertook. We want to know what the fiscal health of the township is. We want to know what it looks like in the long range based on, proposed development. This is our plan, and we need to feel comfortable with all the inputs. The inputs, we have discussion, and we've had lots and lots of meetings, and when we saw the list of meetings, we had a lot of stakeholder input. And the fact that there's disagreement on the PPU and the kind of assessed value really isn't a concern for us to finish this, because we're going to plan our future based on what this financial plan tells us. And we've had examples, should we borrow more money? Should we be building, replacing infrastructure? We're going to make determinations of that. I think the fact that we don't agree on it really is irrelevant, because this is our plan. It's not obligated, as our CAO mentioned, by any legislation or statute. We're doing it for the welfare of all the taxpayers in Springwater. And it just happens we have a possible big development that's going to impact it. And that's why we've gathered all the numbers, and we're doing the different scenarios to address that, the what ifs. And I'll take one final question from...
Well, this is a corollary, because I think what I was trying to say, either I was unclear or I was misunderstood. That amounts to the same.
Hold it close to you, because it's getting weak at
Okay, is that
up in the
better?
top. Yeah.
No, sorry,
Tilt it
everyone.
more.
As someone who doesn't hear properly. I
Speak to
certainly
the top of the mic.
Speak to the top of the mic.
That's
There
it,
we
yeah.
go. Okay. It is, to me, a relevant issue, this dispute over key factors, because I believe affordability and a variation on the theme of the long-range financial plan is one of the 150-plus conditions that has to be satisfied in order for the MSP to go forward. And I believe the specific clause I'm referring to, although I can't quote it, is that it has to be to the satisfaction of the township. So that is where the so-called legislative, I'm using that in a broad sense, angle to my question comes in, respectfully disagreeing with the CAO. There is a tie-in with the MSP in the 150-odd conditions. And that's why I was asking about the fallout.
Yeah, but anyway, we don't want to debate it, but the reality is, whatever our long-term financial plan results are, they're the results. And quite honestly, as a condition, if it doesn't meet our requirements, then there is going to be an issue. And I think, as our CEO rightly suggested, well, then maybe it is a matter of you have to look at the whole development charge issue to make it viable. So I don't think anybody's incorrect in this. It is interesting exercise we're going through, and I'm very pleased at the progress we're at, the information, and some good suggestions we had of maybe adding some information to it. Anyway, I appreciate everybody coming, and anybody that's observing us at home. And if you want more wonderful entertainment like that, return to us in about 48 minutes and for our council meeting. But thank you all for participating.